I don't.
He's usually like 50 minutes to do it. So it's Monday to run late on Monday.
If I go there, I don't like it.
That'll be okay.
Oh yeah, that was.
Oh, yeah, I got it. No, I got C. I didn't do E.
Good morning.
How are you? How was your PLU experience?
It was great. We went in, so they had two rooms of 6 in each, and we all went through our rundown, and then they were gonna pick the best 4 out of them for round 2 for to see who gets in there. And as everyone in our group was going, they were just like, oh yeah, I was like, okay, I see semi have everything together. And as they was going down, the candle guy is the best person. And then we hit ours, and then I was just bam! And we like, yes. This is what 2 weekends past midnight working does. And then we were, and I saw Dr. Howard in the back, and it was the actual one. This is what happened actually in Goldfield. So yeah, we come out of it, we were so good. We were like the best team, and we didn't even make it. We came to the conclusion it wasn't our own original idea. So that was probably why.
It was actually a useful one.
It was actually, compared to candle.
Candle.
Yay!
All right, I'm gonna get kicked off here. So first things first, it is that time of the semester. We have this class and one more on Wednesday. So I need a helpful volunteer to administer the
Or do you have to take it afterwards?
business office up in Old Main.
I have to go there afterwards.
All right, thanks, Leslie.
Yeah,
So I will try and give you guys about 10 minutes here at the end of class to power through the evals, beat the snot out of me, give me whatever feedback that you feel like would be helpful to assist me in improving my instruction. I don't mind, and then get them back to Leslie and she'll turn them in up in the business office.
I think we should do this after the final.
After the final? Oh no! Oh no! So last class we left off, we've been working through working capital management, and last class we left off with the cash conversion cycle, essentially walking through the cash conversion cycle and trying to shorten this up. If you recall, we look at the cash conversion cycle for Unilite, it's 113.4 days. And we talked about methodologies to be able to bring that cash conversion cycle in closer. So that's the amount of time it takes for you from the time you put out the purchase of raw materials to the collection of your accounts receivable. And there's really 3 key components within the cash conversion cycle that you need to manage. The first one is your payables, how long you take to pay them. These folks pay them in 8.8 days. That's kind of silly, should be out 30, maybe 60 days. If you made it 30 or 60 days, all of a sudden your cash conversion cycle shortens up quite a bit. Inventory conversion, which is the amount of time it takes you to take your raw materials and sell them to somebody and ship. They've got that at 79 days. That may or may not be realistic. And we talked about, can they speed up their manufacturing process? Can they go to just-in-time inventory so that the inventory doesn't get purchased until they're actually ready to use it for manufacturing? And that shortens up the inventory cycle. And then we talked about the collection of the accounts receivable. So getting more aggressive on collecting from their customers who are taking 43.2 days. So interestingly, when you look at this, these guys are taking 8.8 days to pay their vendors, and they're waiting 43.2 days to get paid. A companies that excel in working capital management, I'll use Dell Computer as an example. Dell doesn't order until they materials to construct your computer until they've gotten your order and sold the computer and collected it. Dell Computer actually has a cash conversion cycle which is negative. You prepay, then they order the raw materials, then they ship the raw materials, or they manufacture and ship, and then they pay their vendors later. And so they've got a negative cash conversion cycle. That's something that you should strive for in your business. Yes, sir.
So in the situation of just having little to no inventory, where in that portion do you account for the costs associated with ordering and receiving your?
So that's generally going to be part of your overhead cost. So you've got, your purchasing function, your warehousing function, those elements of which purchasing may be more expensive when you're in a just-in-time environment and warehousing might be lower. Those are generally going to be in your fixed overhead. So it's going to be part of your overhead cost. So when you've got current assets and current liabilities, what we've been talking about is how do you time this up? How do you finance those things and make it such that you're able to pay your bills and not run out of cash? And so how do you finance current assets? Relatively straightforward. You either have permanent current assets, so that's, you're always going to maintain a certain level of accounts receivable, you're always going to maintain a certain level of inventory, you're going to need some working capital cash to be able to deal with the ebbs and flows of your business. That's your permanent current assets. Your temporary current assets are ones where you've got significant seasonal fluctuations, where you've got large, for instance, if you're in shipbuilding, where you've got an order, you build the ship and then you ship the ship, no pun intended. You may have relatively high level of current assets at the beginning when you're going to bring in a bunch of inventory, it turns into work in process assets, and then it goes down to zero. And you've got some lumpy fluctuations that are being driven by seasonal economic conditions or order quantities. We talked through these methodologies before, the maturity matching, conservative approach, and aggressive approach. And again, we've said that, and I'm re-emphasizing this because I think this is kind of the critical, practical stuff that you're going to be able to use. It's a moderate approach. The moderate approach is this maturity matching, where you essentially go, okay, I collect my receivables at 43.8 days. I'm going to pay my payables at 43.8 days. The cash in equals the cash out. You don't have to have a significant amount of underlying financing. And we looked at this graph. The next one was looking at a conservative approach, essentially having a significantly higher amount of permanent capital tied up and making sure you've got some additional cash sitting in the bank waiting for you. It's least profitable because you have higher interest expense to finance your temporary current assets because you've got essentially cash sitting in the bank. Having said that, you're less likely to run out. We talked about the fact that when you need cash, the bank tends to not give it to you. And then you've got the aggressive approach, which is your most profitable, where essentially you say, okay, I'm going to finance some of this permanent level of current assets with temporary financing, so with accounts receivable and other components. Skipping through to some sources, we talked through accounts receivable, we talked through accounts payable, we talked through some of the short-term spontaneous types of liabilities that you can use to finance your current assets. The other things that you can do is have a little bit more permanent set of current liabilities, like commercial paper. Commercial paper is essentially a very short-term note, generally not more than 270 days, where it's treated almost as cash. So when you're looking at a money market mutual fund, a lot of times money market mutual funds will be backed with, or will be invested in commercial paper with staggered maturity so that there's a portion of that fund maturing every day. They're unsecured. They're issued by large firms, so little companies can't do commercial paper. Commercial paper is done by folks like General Electric and IBM and Apple. They could use commercial paper to finance large amounts of working capital. And essentially, they're a discounted financial instrument. So what will happen is if Apple wants to raise $100 million of commercial paper, they'll issue it at 97.5 million is what they'll get in. They'll pay back $100 million at 270 days for an effective interest rate of about 4%. So that's how commercial paper works. There's a very active commercial paper market, and most of the time, because commercial paper is in large denominations of millions, it's generally only invested in by institutional investors. So by mutual funds, by banks, by insurance companies. Those are the only folks that really play in a commercial paper market, and only companies that are of huge size are able to play in the commercial paper market from a financing perspective. Secured loans. We talked a little bit about secured loans last class. Secured loans are secured by short-term assets, accounts receivable and inventory. This is relatively typical of a small business, retail business, manufacturer. Essentially, what the bank is going to do is have a borrowing base, and they're going to say every month or every week, you need to report to the bank the value of accounts receivable and the value of inventory. And then they'll allow you to borrow up to 60, 70, 80% of that value. They'll never let you borrow 100% because they recognize that if they have to foreclose that collateral, if they have to seize the collateral because you're not paying, they're not going to be able to liquidate it at 100% of value. So you're going to have a borrowing base, which will be for less than 100% of the value, where essentially they're going to be able to advance you funds on that commercial loan. And then you've got AR financing. So you've got pledged receivables. Essentially, you've got a couple components. You could either put receivables in against the loan and say, okay, all the cash coming in off those receivables are directed, or turboed is what we call it in banking. They're turboed against the loan outstanding balance. So if they advanced you 60% of your accounts receivable, the first dollars in up to the full amount of the loan goes against the loan, and then you get the money after that. So it essentially goes against the pledged receivables as a collateral, or you factor. And factoring is generally more expensive, but you sell your accounts receivable. So you may have $1 million of accounts receivable, and you take those accounts receivable and you sell them for $800,000 to a factor. The factor then is responsible for collection on those, and you normally don't have recourse. They normally can't put them back to you if they're not collectible. And so factoring is a pretty expensive way of converting accounts receivable into cash, but it also may be the only way if you're financially struggling to be able to get money quickly, just to take your accounts receivable and go, okay, instead of 43.8 days, I can get it in 5 days, but I'm going to take a haircut or a discount of 20% in order to be able to do it. And then the factor assumes the responsibility for collection. We talked a little bit about inventory financing. You've got a couple of these. There's 3 different types of collateral. There's a blanket lien, which is essentially the bank says, we have a lien or a security interest on all the inventory. So if anything goes wrong, we can seize all the inventory. There's a trust receipt. Trust receipt is different. Trust receipt essentially is used if you're in a business similar to auto loan or if you're an auto dealer, you're going to have trust receipt collateral. So instead of having a blanket lien over every car that's in the lot, each car is on a floor plan. And essentially that car loan, each car is specifically identified, and each loan against each car is specifically identified. And so the collateral is specifically identified. So if you go bad, they're only going to take those cars that are collateral. And then you've got a warehouse receipt where essentially the collateral for that inventory is going to be sitting separate. And a lot of times this is used in commodities. So you've got grain or corn or something along those lines, and some of it is being used as collateral because it's a relatively fungible asset. The bank will require you to store it separately. So that way, if they need to seize it, they could take that warehouse and seize everything in the warehouse rather than trying to figure out which corn is theirs and which corn is not. And so you have 3 different types of secured collateral when you've got inventory financing. The next thing I'm going to cover briefly, and I'm moving pretty quick because we have this class and one more, and that's it. And I know it's merciful. So you've got principal amount versus required amount. And again, this is when we start talking about things like borrowing bases and short-term financing. Remember, the bank won't give you 100% of the value of anything. They need how many sources of repayment? 3. Banks will generally look to 3 sources of repayment. They'll look to the collateral, they'll look to the business cash flow, and they'll look to you. And they'll also go, okay, we're going to need to maintain a little bit of cushion in the collateral. There's a couple ways they can do that. There's an element here where you've got this $50,000 that is being borrowed, and they say, okay, we've got to provide a 20% compensating balance, which means of the $50,000 you need to borrow, the bank's going to say you've got to put 20% of whatever you borrow in a savings account at the bank to kind of protect us, make us feel more comfortable. And the interest rate is 9%. So to use the $50,000, you actually need to borrow more than $50,000 to get $50,000 because the bank's going to make you put money in a savings account and have it just sit there. And additionally, how much money do you think you're going to pay interest on? $50,000? No, the full amount that you borrowed. And so it's a way for the bank to go, okay, you've got this 9% interest rate, but really the effective interest rate is going to be quite a bit higher, about 20% higher, because 20% of the cash is not going to be available to you. It's going to be sitting in a savings account earning significantly less interest than what you're paying. So here's a little example. And this is common stuff. For those of you, when you get out in the business world, this is normal. This is where you start running into these embedded fees, and you got to kind of compare bank to bank because you might see something where it goes, oh, it's 9% interest. Well, that's better than the 10% I'm getting over here at Bank B. Well, Bank B may not have a compensating balance requirement. And so that 10% may actually be cheaper. So don't allow the headline number to seduce you into going with a bank or a lender because they'll have hidden fees or they'll have hidden requirements like compensating balances that'll drive the cost up. So a firm needs $50,000, interest rate is 9%, compensating balance is 20%. So if you need $50,000 and they only allow you to use 80% of it, the formula is relatively straightforward. You need to borrow $62,500 in order to get $50,000. You're going to be paying interest on $62,500 at 9%. But you only really needed 50 grand. So what ends up happening is you end up paying interest on $62,500, and the effective interest rate isn't 9%. The effective interest rate is closer to 10.5% to 11%. And so the bank is able to get their money out of you. Plus, if you default, they're going to seize the money that's in the savings account. They're going to sue you for the balance. And if you used the money in the savings account or took it, they're going to sue you for $62,500. They're going to send you to jail because you stole their money from compensating balance, which you committed as a trust. And you're going to run into all sorts of pains and sufferings. And so the bank essentially protects themselves in 2 ways here. One, they charge a higher interest rate. And 2, they've got this compensating balance sitting there waiting for you to be able to default so that they can take the money back or part of it. Alternative current asset investment. Oh, the other thing. Compensating balance doesn't tend to go down as your loan balance goes down. So as you're paying back that $62,500, the last dollars are the $12,500 that's sitting in a compensating balance. So you're going to be paying down the loan. You're going to be going from $50,000 to $40,000 to $30,000 to $20,000 to $10,000, and the bank will still be sitting on $12,500 of compensating balance until such time as the loan is paid off, and then your last $12,500 tends to be the compensating balance amount that you're able to pull off and then pay off the remaining principal. So you've got alternative asset investment policies. You've got a relaxed, a restricted, and a moderate. As usual, the more risk you take, the higher the profit. The more risk you take, the higher the return. The more risk you take, the more likely it is that you're going to go upside down on one of these choices. So you've got 3 asset investment policies. The relaxed, so if you got excess cash and you're going, okay, I've got excess cash. What do I do with my excess cash? You got 3 choices. Choice 1 is you got a large amount of cash and marketable securities. you carry those on your balance sheet. And you give a liberal credit policy. You have relatively high receivables. You're relatively slow in collecting your receivables. You get a little bit more aggressive with your cash approach. And you go, okay, I'm going to sell to people I might not sell to otherwise. And I'm going to take a little bit more risk. I'm going to hold a little bit more cash on my balance sheet. And I'm going to create sales that I might not otherwise be able to collect, but I'm going to take a little bit of risk in order to generate those sales. A restricted current asset investment policy, essentially you're going to minimize your holdings of current assets. You're going to keep your current asset levels as low as possible because your return on those assets tends to be relatively low. You can invest them, but you're going to invest them at 1/10 of 1% or 0.2 of 1%. And so you go, hey, I'm going to keep those relatively low. I'm going to keep inventories relatively low. I'm going to keep all my marketable securities relatively low. I'm not going to issue a bunch of accounts receivable. I'm going to run relatively tight, but I'm going to be turning my cash quickly. And then moderate is between relaxed and restricted. So restricted, essentially, you're going, I'm going to be tight on my accounts receivable policies. I'm not going to carry a bunch of cash. I'm not going to carry a bunch of inventory. I'm going to be like a Dell, where I don't hold a bunch of cash. I don't hold a bunch of inventory. I don't have a bunch of accounts receivable because my cash collection cycle is very quick. Relaxed, you're going, okay, I'm going to go with a longer cash collection cycle, but in return, I think I'm going to get a higher amount of sales. And then moderate is between those two. Questions so far? And there it is, graphed. Cash management. The goal is to minimize the amount of cash that a firm holds to conduct its business activities, but is sufficient to pay creditors, maintain its credit rating, and meet unexpected cash needs. Why do you think you want to minimize the amount of cash you hold?
Stave off those vultures trying to buy you out.
Stave off the vultures. Okay, set that one aside. True. But we'll set that aside. Why else do you want to minimize your cash holdings? So expand on that, Jason. Earn money on how?
Yeah, by investing in other opportunities.
Yeah, so here's the deal. You got cash. How many of you guys have savings accounts? What's the interest rate you're getting on your savings account?
1%.
1%. You're doing pretty well.
0.0.
0.0. Between 1/10 of 1% and 1% on your savings account. And so if you are sitting on cash as a business, you're doing one of two things. You're either earning 1% or less on that cash. And again, when we go back to what our capital structure and return requirements are, generally for equity, it's going to be higher than 1%. Generally on debt, we're going to be paying more than 1%. And so you're sitting there going, okay, I'm holding cash at 1%, and I should have either paid down debt and reduced my interest expense, or I should invest it in projects which are going to meet my hurdle rate based upon my business's risk profile, reinvested that, or I should have dividended it out to my shareholders. I should not sit on cash. I don't earn anything. So I either need to pay my creditors down if I've got excess cash. I need to dividend it out if I don't have alternatives. Or I need to take a look at what other investments can I make in order to be able to drive my return on equity up. The only amount of cash you should be sitting on is that which is required to pay your creditors timely or near timely. Maintain a credit rating, because again, businesses have credit ratings just like you do, so they don't have a FICO score, they have a Moody's or an S&P score or Fitch's, and then you've got meet unexpected cash needs. And these two are tied together. Really what happens is your credit rating agencies will look at a business, look at its seasonality, look at its history, look at the industry it's in, look at its comparables, just like we did with Unilite, and go, based upon those things, there should be X amount of cash. And if there is less, it's risky, so it impacts your credit rating. If it's more, then They may not be optimizing their investment, so the vultures might come in and take it, but they're probably a better credit risk because they've got excess cash sitting around. So it may impact their credit rating positively, but they're sitting on excess cash. So cash management is critically important to a firm because it is your lifeblood. It is what we study in finance. Really, all we look at in finance is the expected future value cash flows and how we invest them at a various risk rate, which is reflected in a discount. And this is really the lifeblood of how we manage our firm. And we want to sit on as little cash as possible and either reinvest it in new projects, dividend it out to investors, or use it to pay down higher cost debt. The reason you would hold cash, you need a certain amount to run day to day, to cycle money through. You've got to deal with mistiming of payments and collections. So you may have payroll every 2 weeks, but your average accounts receivable balance doesn't come in for 43.8 days. And so you've got to be able to have enough cash to cover that. And then you've got these compensating balance requirements where, again, the bank goes, you've got to maintain, in the case we just looked at, to borrow $50,000, you've got to maintain a balance of $62,500, of which $12,500 needs to be sitting in a savings account at the bank. You can't use that for your bills. You can't use that for anything. It's just got to sit in the savings account at the bank. And so compensating balances may appear on the balance sheet as cash, but it's really not available for use. So you're going to be holding cash, but you can't actually use it. You've got the precautionary balance in case there's fluctuation in cash flow. And you can use lines of credit to reduce the amount of cash you need. So if you've got access to a line of credit and you can deal with fluctuations on a line of credit, you can go, okay, I don't need cash. So some folks, maybe some folks in this room, maintain almost zero balances in their checking account. But you got a credit card, you charge the credit card, then you pay off the credit card. You charge the credit card, you pay off the credit card. So instead of maintaining cash in your checking account using a debit card and running it up and down, you run your cash down to zero and you use a credit card and you run a credit card up and down instead. That's how it would work on a line of credit for a business. So you have less cash required because you're going to borrow the money short term. And then you've got the speculative balance where essentially you're going, okay, I need to have money in my pocket just in case. So we may have some folks in here who, like when I was in college, tended to have a couple $1,000 in my pocket in case there was a cool car I wanted to buy and flip. So I would go out, buy the car, detail it out, and flip the car. And so I had to have some cash available because the best way to buy a car, of course, is you walk up to somebody who's trying to sell it for $2,500 and you go, I'll give you $1,800 now. I got the cash in my hand to sell the car. About 70% of the time they go, okay, fine, I just want it out of my driveway. And then you go clean it up, flip it for $3,000. So that's your speculative balance. Businesses do the same thing. They maintain cash availability because they may go, there's a small business I want to buy, or I want to look at acquisition of some equipment, and all of a sudden it goes on sale, and I can't go through the process of raising funds through the equity or debt market because that may take 90 days or 120 days. And so if I've got the cash in my pocket, I could go make a below market bid for that business, and if they're desperate enough to sell, I can get a bargain and I can make that purchase, whether it's of additional inventory or whether it's of another business. Any questions on cash balances before we talk cash budget?
Maybe unrelated. I know in accounting we have a reorder point for inventory. So for this, is there something equatable to safety stock, or just like months, 2 months worth?
Yeah. So the question is, in cash management, is there something equivalent for those of you who are accounting majors and have concerns around things like economic order quantities and stock out? Is there a safety stock? Is there essentially a minimum amount of cash that we need to hold? And how much should that be? Should it be, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? And the answer is yes to the first part. Yes, you would normally have that safety stock, that precautionary balance.
Right.
And the amount it depends. And it really depends on the volatility of your business your access to short-term debt, so your access to a line of credit. And when you look at, we're going to kind of talk through cash budget, which is going to help identify that, what your tolerance for risk is. Because the less cash you hold, the riskier it is, but also the higher your potential return, because you're theoretically reinvested that cash into somewhere else, used it to pay down long-term debt, or dividended it out to your shareholders. So cash budget. Cash budget is nothing more than trying to figure out how much cash do I need at any given point in the year. Because what you don't want to do is run out of cash. That's a bad answer for your business. And so what you're going to do, this is essentially transforming your accounting statements, your pro forma looking forward accounting statements, into a cash budget. Into, okay, how much cash do I need every month? How much cash do I need every week? In some cases, when I was in some troubled businesses as either the CFO, the controller, or the chief operating officer, we did cash budgeting for the next 2 weeks every day and rolled it forward because we were running that tight to running out of cash. And so you need to be able to monitor and control your cash in and cash out. And so your cash budget is nothing more than doing that for a certain period of time, normally a few weeks out to a year out. Your target cash balance is kind of what you were talking about, Jesus. It's minimum cash balance a firm needs to have to maintain business. So it's essentially your safety stock. This is, we'll go down to this level and we don't want it to go any lower. And so that becomes your floor when you're doing your cash budgeting. The easiest way to approach it is you look at this disbursements and receipts method. You look at how much money is coming in, how much money is going out, you net the two together, that's your net cash flow for the day or for the period, and you add that to your beginning cash balance, and you flow that through, making sure that you don't fall below your targeted cash balance, which is your floor. Oh, goodness. So here's a look at Unilite. And we've got sales May, June, July through December. You've got purchases. So the purchases are 60% of the next month's sales. So starting out here in July, you've got this month's sales net. So 2% times 98% times the current month's sales. You've got the previous month's sales, which is coming in, and then you've got sales from 2 months ago. So essentially you're saying 7, 8, 9, 10. This is the speed at which I collect. This is how much I'm going to collect in each one of these. This is how much cash comes in, and then you've got how much cash goes out, and you're going to end up with a net change. And that net change is really what you're looking at to try and determine what's my cash adds or subtracts. So when you flow it, you've got your cash disbursements, your cash outs, you've got your cash purchases, which are paid for the month after purchase. So remember, we were paying at 8.8 days. If we stretch that out to 30 days, you've got your wages, which are paid 1 month after purchase, okay. Rent, other expenses, taxes, which are paid quarterly, and payments for property, plant, equipment. So asset purchases. Again, asset purchases aren't going to show up in terms of expenses. They're generally going to go onto the balance sheet. But for a cash budget, you need to treat them as an expense. Here at the university, we're basically on this same methodology, and we treat every expense or every cash outflow as an expense until July, when we reclass them all as either property, plant, equipment, depreciable assets, accruals, etc. So you've got your total disbursements in each month running across the bottom. Essentially, here's what we looked at the cash inflows last time, which were driven by how long it takes us to collect. This is our cash outflows per month. And then we stack the two on top of each other. So you got your total receipts from 2 months, a month, and the current month, current disbursements to get you a net cash flow. We started with a beginning cash balance of $8 million. So now you've got a negative cash balance of 4.1 million because you had essentially $12.1 million of cash outflow in this period. You started with 8, you've got an ending cash balance negative. We don't do negative cash balances generally. You can. Sometimes with a 0 balance account, you can have outstanding checks and no cash, and the checks haven't cleared yet. And so you can run a cash balance on your balance sheet that's negative, but I wouldn't recommend it. So we've got a stock out, or we've got a targeted cash balance or a floor of $5 million. And so you've got shortfalls. So essentially what we've done is we've looked and we said, okay, in July, we're going to be short $9.1 million from our $5 million target. In September, we're going to be short $70.4 million because this rolls through. Essentially, you can see that this rolls up and you start cycling back through. So 4.1 goes to here. Now we're 28.4 negative. 28.4 negative flows through here. Then we're at 65.4 negative. 65.4 negative flows through here. 21.7, etc. So this is really just flowing your cash flow through the cash budget and recognizing that in order to maintain this $5 million target cash balance, the lowest point, we're going to be $70.4 million short in cash. And so your job as a financial manager is to identify how am I going to come up with $70.4 million. There's a few techniques you can use to get there. And as you can see, some of these are going the way of the dodo because the banks have essentially said we've gone to this system called Check 21, where we try and clear everything immediately. So historically, you looked at things like synchronized cash flow. So you said, okay, when cash comes in, cash goes out. So in some of those periods, we might be slowing down payables. We might be trying to accelerate receivables. You might be able to do factoring or get a bank loan on an advance because you've got additional inventory buildup or accounts receivable buildup to be able to get to your $70 million. Check clearing. Check clearing is you take a check, you write it, you mail it, and it takes 4 or 5 days for it to get to whoever you get to. It may take them a day to get it in the bank. It may take 2 days for the bank to clear it through your account. So you got a week before, from the time you write a check until that check clears your bank. Check clearing is going the way of the dodo because most people don't pay by check anymore. They pay by ACH, which is 24 hours. They pay by wire, which is instant. So electronic banking has essentially taken this concept of sitting down and writing checks, although the university still does it, has taken this concept of writing checks away. So check clearing as a cash flow management tool has become a little bit more challenging. Float. Float is the difference between the balance shown on the checkbook and the balance for the bank's records. So again, as I was talking, you've got these things called zero balance accounts. We talked about them last class. Zero balance account essentially says, my checking account always has $0 in it. When I make a deposit, the bank takes the money for the deposit and sweeps it against my line of credit and pays the line of credit down. When I have checks clear, the bank takes the money from the line of credit and advances it up against my checking account to cover the clearing checks. So that's a zero balance account. If you write $2 million worth of checks today and they haven't cleared the bank, on your general ledger, you're going to show $2 million worth of float. You're going to show negative $2 million bank balance because you've written checks. They haven't advanced them off your line of credit yet. It's technically, from an accounting perspective, you'll be treating that as a short-term liability, not a negative short-term asset, for those of you in the accounting world. However, for finance, it's float. It's $2,003 that we're borrowing from the bank. Float is in red because, again, the use of float has really diminished with the increase in electronic banking, direct deposit, ACH, wire. Any questions on these tactics or techniques? Okay, so I'm going to turn the class over to Leslie so she can administer the evaluations. Thank you very much. I will see you all on Wednesday, where we will wrap these 2 chapters in a bow. Just a reminder that next Monday, 5:30 in this room, if you want, there will be a review, and the final is Tuesday at 10 in this room next week.